The Renaissance, the greatest cultural explosion in Western history, wasn't driven by artists or philosophers. It was financed by bankers who built their empire on a practice the Catholic Church had banned as a mortal sin: lending money at interest. The Medici went from obscurity to producing 4 popes, 2 queens of France, and effectively owning Florence. But here's the mystery. How does one banking family achieve that? And what does their rise and catastrophic fall reveal about power itself? Because the strategies they pioneered 5 centuries ago, modern corporations are still using them, and the pattern that destroyed the Medici keeps repeating today. Florence in the 1400s wasn't an artistic paradise. It was a cutthroat textile hub of 40,000 people, where the streets literally ran with urine used to clean fabric. But it had one thing most cities didn't: the florin, a gold coin so trusted it became medieval Europe's dollar. Here's the problem. The Catholic Church had banned usury, lending at interest, as a mortal sin. Time belonged to God, so charging for it meant selling what you didn't own. But medieval Europe needed capital. Merchants needed loans. Kingdoms needed financing. So bankers developed elaborate workarounds, disguising interest as fees or exchange rate fluctuations. The Medici would master this shadow system, but their real innovation wasn't financial. It was psychological. In 1397, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici made a calculated move that changed everything. Instead of competing for royal clients who regularly defaulted, he became the banker to the papal court itself. The genius? The Pope collected taxes from parishes across Europe. All that money needed to move back to Rome. Giovanni positioned the Medici Bank as the financial infrastructure for church operations. He wasn't lending to the church, he was becoming indispensable to it. First Medici innovation? Don't just play the game, become the game's infrastructure. When Giovanni died in 1429, he left his son Cosimo a network of branches across Europe and relationships with every cardinal who mattered. But in Republican Florence, appearing powerful was dangerous, and the old families were watching. In 1433, Florence's oligarchy arrested Cosimo and exiled him. This should have ended the Medici story. Instead, Cosimo turned it into a masterclass in soft power. From Venice, he quietly let Florence feel his absence. Credit dried up, the wool trade slowed. After 1 year, the city begged him to return. Cosimo had learned the crucial lesson: never hold official power when you can hold real power. For 30 years, Cosimo ran Florence without holding office. He called himself a private citizen, dressed modestly, lived simply. But every major decision required his approval. His method? The Medici Bank perfected stakeholder management. Cosimo lent money to everyone who mattered, not always expecting it back. He funded churches, sponsored artists like Donatello, supported scholars. Second Medici innovation? Use money to create moral and cultural debt, not just financial debt. When you owe the bank money, you're in trouble. When you owe them your career, your business, your church's chapel, and your scholarly reputation, now you're invested in their success. His grandson, Lorenzo, took this further. Lorenzo, the Magnificent, barely bothered with banking. He spent on artists, poets, philosophers, festivals. Michelangelo lived in their household. Botticelli painted for them. Leonardo received commissions through their network. This wasn't philanthropy, it was cultural hegemony. Control what people value, what they consider beautiful and true, and you control them more effectively than any army. By the 1480s, the Medici weren't just rich, they were the brand that defined civilization. And that's when everything started cracking. Here's what they don't tell you. At their peak, the Medici Bank was already failing. Lorenzo was a brilliant cultural strategist, but a terrible banker. The London branch collapsed in 1478. Bruges failed in 1480. The bank was bleeding money, propped up only by Lorenzo's political manipulation. But Lorenzo couldn't stop spending. The spending was the source of his power. Admitting financial weakness meant political collapse. Then, 1494, France invaded Italy. The political landscape Lorenzo had cultivated shattered overnight. Within months, the Medici were driven from Florence by a friar named Savonarola, who convinced the city their decline was divine punishment. The Medici Bank dissolved. The empire seemed finished. But here's the twist. They came back twice. By the mid-1500s, they weren't just rulers, they were hereditary dukes. How? The church, the institution they'd bankrolled for over a century, paid dividends. The family produced 4 popes between 1513 and 1605. Pope Leo X and Clement VII used church power to restore Medici dominance. Final innovation: when financial capital runs out, convert cultural capital into institutional power. By the 1600s, the Medici ruled Tuscany for another 150 years until the family line died out in 1737. The Medici playbook is repeating today with eerie precision. Modern tech companies start by providing essential infrastructure, payments, communication, transportation. They become indispensable. Then they convert that into cultural influence, funding research, shaping discourse, defining innovation. Finally, they convert cultural power into regulatory capture. Amazon owns commerce infrastructure. Google defines information itself. They followed the exact Medici strategy: infrastructure, cultural power, institutional control. The numbers are staggering. In 2024, the top 5 tech companies held over $7 trillion in market value, more than every country's GDP except the US and China. The Medici took 150 years to go from bankers to hereditary rulers. Tech dynasties compressed that to decades. But here's the warning. This model always contains its own destruction. The Medici failed as bankers because they obsessed over power instead of fundamentals. Lorenzo ignored basic finance while buying influence. When politics shifted, they had nothing solid beneath them. We're watching this repeat. WeWork sold lifestyle, not real estate. Theranos performed innovation theater. FTX purchased legitimacy, not actual value. The pattern? Financial capital becomes cultural capital, becomes institutional power, becomes vulnerability. When your power rests on reputation and influence, it evaporates instantly. The Medici thought they'd transcended normal rules. They hadn't. They just delayed the reckoning. The later Medici tried solving their problems with the same formula: spectacle and spending. When they returned to power, they built bigger palaces, commissioned more art, threw elaborate festivals. The Medici Chapel and Uffizi Gallery were monuments to their invincibility. But these weren't vanity projects. They were desperate attempts to recreate what worked before. The Medici genuinely believed cultural investment could solve economic problems. It couldn't, because the world had changed. Banking evolved, nation-states consolidated. The mechanisms that made them indispensable in 1450 were obsolete by 1550. This is legacy thinking's trap. The strategies that build empires rarely sustain them. The Medici kept running their glory days playbook, never realizing the game had changed. We see this now with institutions trying to compete digitally. Traditional banks launching awkward fintech. Retail stores building websites that feel like stores. Studios trying to beat Netflix by making expensive shows for their own platforms. They're executing the old strategy harder instead of recognizing the rules shifted. The Medici couldn't fix their decline because they couldn't admit what broke. They'd confused their methods with their magic. They thought patronage was power's source when it was just power's expression. When underlying power disappeared, bank failure, foreign occupation, new financial systems, cultural achievements remained, but political control evaporated. First, infrastructure is ultimate leverage. The Medici became powerful not by having money, but by controlling how it moved. Position yourself where value must flow through you, and you'll have more power than people with 10 times your resources. Second, cultural capital is real, but not enough. The Medici proved you can buy legitimacy and define civilization. But cultural power without fundamentals is facade. When the foundation cracks, everything collapses. Remember Lorenzo running an empire while his bank dissolved beneath him.
Third, strategies that build power rarely sustain it. The Medici couldn't evolve beyond their successful formula. Your competitive advantage has an expiration date. The question isn't whether your strategy will become obsolete, it's whether you'll recognize it when it does. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Medici weren't defeated by enemies. They were defeated by their own success. They built a system so effective at converting money into power that they forgot why money mattered. We live in an era optimizing for influence, reach, cultural impact, all the intangibles the Medici mastered. But influence without substance is performance art. Eventually, the audience goes home. The Renaissance happened because the Medici funded it, but it survived because the art and ideas were real. The power structure that created it vanished completely. So here's the question. What are we building that will outlast our empires? If you found this deep dive into power, money, and recurring patterns valuable, subscribe. There's even more to come.